Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. With the World Championship just around the corner, I thought I would give you a quick rundown as to what I expect to be the most played cards and the shared cards for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel World Championship players, right? If you don't know, we're actually going to take a look at the rules real quick. The decks within the Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel aspect of the World Championship require you to not share any cards among your team. And each team has the ability to have a total of 6 decks, meaning that across all 6 decks, you can only share 3 cards, or more specifically, 3 names of cards. So, for example, Ash Blossom, Called By, and Maxi, which have been pretty stable throughout the previous years. Those 3 tend to be shared cards. Now, that was the case previously. If we actually look at the previous World Championships, I had it highlighted and it disappeared. Says 3 shared cards here. You can only have 3 total shared cards across all 6 of your decks. However, Master Duel recently has changed that to 5 shared cards, and that's kind of why I'm doing this video. I think the difference between 3 and 5 shared cards is quite substantial, because having 3 staple cards that can be applied to any of your decks isn't a ton. So generally speaking, you do have to use other tech options, right? Like, for example, if you did have Ash, Maxi, and Called By in all of your decks, that's still 10-ish cards, depending on the deck, of non-engine that you could potentially fit in. You know, that would need to be something else, right? Like an Imperm, or a Veiler, or a Droll, or something of that nature, right? Something that, until now, for the most part, you've been able to see a wide array of different non-engine, and that has also influenced the amount of decks that are playable, right? For example, right now, we have Branded and Branded Draco Tail, both of which are fairly similar decks and have a lot of shared cards. And if both of those decks in the past were to exist at the same time during this during the World Championship, what would happen is you would basically be able to choose one or the other, because you can't share enough cards to make it worthwhile or even possible to kind of play both, right? However, now with the 5 shared cards, I do believe that it is a possibility to play both Branded and Branded Draco Tail. And so we're going to get into that. Starting off, we are going to just... I have a bunch of hand traps and I have a bunch of engines. So we're going to start off here with the engines, because I think this one is a little bit more interesting. Because, again, now that we have 5 cards for the shared cards, it means that you can have an entire engine. Like, the Fiendsmith engine technically only requires Engraver, Tract, and that's it, right? The reason we didn't see it in the past, in the most recent World Championship, is because even if it took up 2 slots, that's 2 slots that you wouldn't be able to use for Maxi, Called By, Fualos, Ash Blossom, Imperm, something of that nature. And so it wasn't really worth it to have a deck or multiple decks that wanted to play Fiendsmith, when you could just instead play a more staple card that could go into every single one of your decks, right? Now, with 5, I think that changes. So we're going to go through some of the engines, and realistically, there is basically one engine that we're going to talk about here, which is the Fallen and the Virtuous engine, because Fallen and the Virtuous is a card that is so incredibly powerful because of the fact that it can recur itself and can be easily applicable across pretty much every archetype and every deck. Meaning that, generally speaking, I would be surprised if this didn't become a shared card in every archetype, or in every team, because it's extremely good in Branded, it's extremely good in Draco Tail, it's extremely good in Cool Tune, it's fairly decent in things like Elf Note and Malice, it's really good in Sky Striker and Radiant Typhoon. Pretty much every single one of the top archetypes wants to play this card and is going to try to finagle a way to play this alongside Albion, right? The extra deck monster specifically, right? Because that would just give you the ability to play it in the most amount of decks. You would be able to play 3 copies. You would be able to play multiple of the Albions in your extra decks. You'd be able to play it across all 6 of your decks. And if you really wanted to, you could spend a little bit more of your shared cards to get the second engine that I want to talk about here, which is the White Albaz engine. This, alongside the Fallen and the Virtuous engine, provides such an insane value across the board, and because of the way that shared cards work, or the way that sharing cards work, it means that even just by sharing White Albaz, you would still be able to use things like Ecclesia and the other regular Albaz across your decks without having to identify them as a shared card. So someone has 1 Albaz, and then that can be shared across 3 different decks, right? And then you have the same thing with like an Ecclesia, or with a Cartesia, or with a Quem, or something of that nature, right? So generally speaking, with these two, 3 shared cards is all you technically need. You could potentially bump it up to 4, depending on what you actually need or want. But 3 shared cards still leaves you access to Ash, Droll, Fua, Imperm, even something like Dominus Impulse, if you really wanted to. So I think that is extremely likely as far as engines goes. And we're going to go through the rest of these engines real quick, because I don't think a ton of them are likely. First and foremost, Primite has the ability to be an option, but I don't think there are going to be enough decks to warrant playing Primite as a option just across the board. I do think there's like a possibility someone shares like Ether Barrel, maybe, but realistically, I don't think it's going to be all too common. Kashtira, I think, does have a fairly good chance, specifically Fenris, because Fenris can just kind of be slapped into a whole bunch of decks, and because it searches itself and is a board breaker, it would be one of those options. I think I even have it in here as well, right? It's just one of those options that does so well because of how powerful just the generic guy is, that, yeah, I could realistically see that. I don't realistically see Silohat Rat or the Tri-Brigade or Yummy or that one. We're just going to go through the ones that I don't believe are going to see any realistic play as... This is not necessarily that these are bad engines, but it's more so that, like, oh, these aren't going to be shared cards, right? Because of, like, archetypal reasons, right? We'll talk about Fiendsmith. Not that one. Probably not that one. Definitely not that one. Likely not that one. I doubt Elf Note is going to be a, like, additional engine that someone would play. Okay, we'll talk about these. So, first and foremost, Dogma. Dogma, I think... as long as... if we're talking about specifically Deer Servant, I really don't think this is an option, mostly due to the fact that there's not a purpose to playing Dogmatica outside of Branded. You would probably just give it to the Branded deck anyway, and so sharing that as far as like shared engines, I don't think it's realistic. Fimena, I think, actually does have a fairly good chance of being a staple, just because if there's any other fusion decks, which there are a few currently in the metagame, but like any fusion deck could make use of Fimena, so there could be some like Shadal shenanigans, or there could be like, you know, you may want to play it in Branded without playing it as, or without cutting yourself off of Draco Tail, so like there is that chance that Fimena just as an engine kind of by itself sees play. I'm not 100% sold on that. I'm actually going to put it in the niche. Magistus, I think, also has that ability to be a niche tech option, because Spellcaster stuff, and specifically Spenta for the Magistus Spellcaster stuff, I think it does have a lot of options with the new Fairy Tale, with the Shining Sark, with like Dragoon Turbo, with the Elf Note stuff. Like, there's a bunch of ways that Spenta and specifically the Magistus cards can provide some value. I don't think it's going to be fairly likely, but there you go. Azamina also has some fairly solid engines for it, right? Like Diabellstar could be useful, all of the White Forest stuff, but just like the ability to go into an Omni Negate is pretty solid. I don't think it's going to be likely just due to the fact that, again, there are better options, but there's that. Radiant Typhoon Vision, I think, is probably the most likely outside of these two as far as engines goes. because Radiant Typhoon Vision specifically gives you the ability to both search a card and draw cards, which is incredibly powerful in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And being able to use this during the draw phase to play around things like Droll is also advantageous, because Droll is also likely to be a shared card, or at least can be a shared card. We'll talk about that in a second. But for the most part, as far as engine goes, it's mostly just Vision, but you could expand this as well to additional Radiant Typhoon cards like Chant and the actual monsters themselves. And it's one of those things where by just giving Vision, you can give that to multiple different decks, right? Not just Vision, but like the Radiant Typhoon cards themselves, right? You could give additional Chants and what have you to multiple different decks if you wanted to. K9, I also think, has a chance to see play in a bunch of different archetypes. I think K9 is pretty applicable just across the board, and I don't think that there's a ton of purpose to play it outside of like a dedicated K9 strategy, but adding like Izuna as a shared card as a way to kind of catch opponents who maybe aren't playing around K9s could be pretty useful. And I think that is, again, maybe not likely, but I do think it's an option. The Millennium stuff I don't think is really all that powerful right now, at least in multiple archetypes, so I don't think it's going to be a shared card. Same thing with Sky Striker. As much as Engage is really powerful, I think the Sky Striker deck is likely to just be a deck itself, and you're not likely to see a whole bunch of archetypal, I guess not archetypal, you're not likely to see like a shared cards, right? Because Sky Striker needs to be able to search other Sky Striker cards, which means that you would have to either add additional shared cards or not play those shared cards, and it would only really apply to 2 decks. Maybe you could get it to apply to 3, but realistically, it's probably just a 2-deck kind of thing. So I don't think it's likely. And then we have Fiendsmith, which I actually do think is fairly likely. Fiendsmith, again, it's 2 cards for the entire engine for all of your decks, basically. Not all of them, to be fair. It's only 3 that you would be able to do that with. But you basically only need the 2 cards of Tract and Engraver in order to give Fiendsmith to pretty much every single one of your decks, which means that every single one of your decks has an ability to pivot into, hey, is that any 2 guys? Do the full Fiendsmith combo, which isn't a terrible option, right? Especially with the DD High Wave King Caesar, or DD Wave High King Caesar, however you're supposed to say it, being as powerful as it is. So there you go. Again, it's mostly, I wanted to talk about the fact that because now we have 5 cards, the likelihood of you being able to play Fallen and the Virtuous across all of your decks is extremely high, and it's kind of disappointing because previously you would see a whole bunch of different engines and a whole bunch of different ideas, and now it's kind of like homogenized because of the additional 2 shared cards across the decks. It's kind of frustrating, but alas. Speaking of, let's go into the hand traps, which we have multiple armies. That's cute. Yeah, we're gonna go through the hand traps in a similar fashion. I guess it's hand traps and board breakers, more of the not engines specifically, but specific cards. Now, again, most of these will likely end up in no, or just like not played. But as far as shared cards go, obviously Fallen and Virtuous, we already talked about that. Ash is also extremely likely for the purpose of stopping the Charmies, which we're going to talk about. Fua is also extremely likely. Perulia is fairly likely. I don't think it's the most likely, but I do think it's fairly likely. And then Meowls is basically a no. I really highly doubt Meowls as a shared card, but I don't think it's a bad option to spread kind of across a couple of decks, right? The only reason I don't think it's as good is because while, yes, there are a lot of decks that do play into it, I don't think it's as easily applicable as something like Fua or as Perulia across all of the decks. And it's one of those things where it's like you could throw this into a specific counter deck, like for example your deck to beat Branded or your deck to beat Malice or something of that nature, whatever ends up actually being meta. You could throw it in there and be like, okay, here's the deck that's going to beat this, they get this card, and then you kind of just don't use it in the other decks. It's not too hard in that regard. So maybe it'll be an option where you just play like a bunch of Charmies in all of your decks, but it's highly unlikely. As far as board breakers go, I really don't think Raigeki or Lightning Storm are going to be a option for decks, because there aren't a lot of decks that can make use of this. And generally speaking, because we have multiple options, right? Like, for example, Dark Hole and Illusion Gate are also on here. There's so many ways to break a board and to specifically destroy a board that I don't think there's a reason to play specifically Raigeki or Illusion Gate or something like that as your shared card. Now, Illusion Gate, I do think, has a little bit more application as a shared card, so I'm going to put it in niche tech option. I could see specifically PAX team playing Illusion Gate as a way to incentivize you, or not incentivize, but as a way to like catch people off guard, so that their like Cool Tune deck and their brand deck or something of that nature ends up having like an out there. However, the problem with that is that you could also just spread it across 3 decks and have a way to search it with that of the, I don't think Thrust is on here, but you would search it with Thrust. Oh yeah, there it is. There you go. I think Thrust is a fairly likely option as far as a shared card goes, because of the fact that being able to search out cards can make it easier for other staple cards to be spread across decks, right? So I think adding Thrust is kind of a pretty solid option. Deck Lockdown's just really not great right now anyway. Gamma, it's at 1. There's no way you would play that, because you'd also have to then split up Driver, which makes it really bad. Fissure, I think, is unlikely to be played, because that is, again, kind of a tech option for specific decks. Same thing with the Different Dimension Ground, same thing with Shifter. There's just not a whole lot of decks that can make use of these cards within their own archetype or within their own deck. So you probably don't want to share it, because, you know, if you're playing, let's say Malice, right? You just give the Shifter to the Malice player. Maybe you could give it to like the Vanquish Soul Canine player as well, but I don't think it's worth taking up a slot for that specifically. Same thing with Mistaken Arrest is only useful sometimes. It's not always useful. Even the Master I could see as kind of a niche tech option, as a way to kind of deal with a bunch of boards, because right now there's not a whole lot of boards that beat an evenly matched, right? Like Branded kind of falters to it, Draco Tail kind of falters to it. I guess Malice can negate it, so there's that, but not a whole lot of decks. Not a whole lot of decks have the ability to effectively beat evenly matched, but enough do that I don't think it's fantastic, right? Like Malice can beat it, and Elf Note can beat it, Cool Tune can beat it, so Valor, I think, could be an option as a shared card, but I think there are better options, that being Imperm. I think Imperm is just a more likely option for that. So there's that. Delta is very similar. You'd have to share drivers, so it's not really worth it to share. Dominus Spark is not applicable in enough decks to warrant its inclusion. Even though it is an incredibly powerful card, I don't think it's likely to see play as a shared card, because while it is very powerful, it does cut you off of a whole bunch of archetypes and a whole bunch of decks, right? Like Branded could share it, but then you wouldn't be able to play it in Draco Tail or in Cool Tune or in Elf Note. I guess you could play it in Malice as well, so there's like some cards and some decks that could play it. I don't know, maybe it sees play. Fenris we kind of already talked about, but realistically I don't see it being that great of an option. Unicorn, basically not at all. Called By, I think could be, but the fact that it is limited to 1 makes me say that it's unlikely that it sees a slot taken up, just because it's like, oh, that'd be 1 card in every deck as opposed to a potential of 3 cards. So there's that. Forbidden Crown, I think, is actually fairly likely. I think it's just a really powerful card right now, and it is just kind of not an auto include, but like an easy slot into pretty much every deck. So there's that. Dark Ruler, I don't see as a realistic option. Same thing with Ghost Ogre. Double Cyclone. Phydraulis, I think, also is fairly likely, mostly due to the fact that Phydraulis, while it doesn't have as many applicable decks, because it specifically needs synchro, I think it's so powerful a card that your synchro decks really heavily want it, right? Elf Note and Cool Tune are the big notable ones, but you could also play like a control deck that just plays Fidrawless, right? Like Yummy or Mitsu or something of that nature. That would also want to play that card, which makes it even more powerful as an option as your shared card. Make sense? Ghost Bell, I think, is pretty unlikely, just because, while, yes, it is a powerful card, I don't think it's powerful enough to warrant that additional slot. But maybe. Chalice, no. Contact Scene, no. Cross Out, no. Again, same reason for Called By, though Cross Out, I think, is way less applicable, because even if you are guaranteed kind of a mirror match, it's just not nearly as useful, because it's not going to hit as many hand traps. There's just going to be less shared cards across the board, so it's a lot less likely to have a target to even hit, right? Or an effective target, I should say. Spiral, I think, is no. No. Droplet, maybe. I think Droplet's really good right now, and so being able to share that across multiple decks, a lot of decks can make use of it as well, so there's that. We already talked about this one. Metal Drones is highly unlikely. Nibiru could see a shared card option, but again, I highly doubt it. Mostly due to the fact that while yes, Nibiru is still powerful, it's not nearly as powerful as it has been in the past, and it's not nearly as much of a game ender, and it's also one of those cards that you could share one copy of across a bunch of different decks because of things like Fuwa, Maxi, and Perulia, that just like makes it so that you could draw into it, and then you don't have to play multiple, you just draw into it, and kind of use it as a threat. Sheena is only playable in like one deck anyway. Triple Attack, I think, is actually very likely. We already talked about this one, so I'm not going to talk about it again. But Triple Attack, I think, is actually very likely because we have that additional slot open, and because of both Maxi and Called By, which, by the way, I don't have Maxi on here. It'd be right where Called By is. For this same reasons. It's limited to one. It's only one card across a bunch of different decks, and we have other draw cards as well. And while it is very powerful, I don't think it's likely to be shared, because, again, you could just... we have other draw cards, and you could share other similarly powerful cards. And a lot of decks also play around Maxi really well. So there's that. But, regardless, Triple Attack, on the other hand, Triple Attack has the ability to be used in a bunch of different archetypes and a bunch of different decks. However, again, unlike... I don't know. I think it's extremely likely that a lot of decks or a lot of teams will make use of it as their shared card, just because it is something that's so easily slottable into a bunch of different decks, and it can punish a bunch of hand traps. It's good at going first, it's good at going second. It's just kind of like that easily applicable card that is super nice to throw into a bunch of archetypes. Speaking of which, we also have Droll, which I think is also extremely likely to be a shared card. So, there you go. Mourner, no. I think there's a chance. No, there's not. It's limited to one. Songs of the Dominator is really rare to have be playable. Like, it would be playable in like Odeon, but outside of that, not a ton of decks wants to make use of Dominator. So there's that. We already talked about this one. The Solemns, unlikely to see shared card status. Same thing with the Floodgates. I don't think we talked about that one. This is one of those weird Floodgates. Ultimate Slayer, again, unlikely. It's just another one of the board breakers. There's a bunch of those, so I don't think it's necessarily applicable. And then we have both Purge and Impulse. I think Impulse is fairly likely to see play in a bunch of archetypes. The problem is that it locks you out of light monsters, which not a ton of decks have the ability to play without lights and some of the other stuff. Well, even being able to make use of it. However, it's still not bad, right, as a option. And then Purge is similar. However, it's kind of worse because it locks you out of Darks, which a lot of decks want to make use of Darks. So, for the most part, while they are good cards, again, this is not necessarily the power level of cards, more so how likely they are to see shared card status. And so, while, yeah, these cards are extremely powerful, both of them, not every deck even has the option to play them, just because they need like specific cards to resolve, and being able to, or like cutting off your options by using these cards from hand can really heavily hinder your deck. So there's that. And that's pretty much it. Yeah. I think the Fallen and the Virtuous Engine being as easily available as it is now makes it a lot less interesting, I think, for the shared cards. I'm actually going to move this one down. But I still think we are fairly likely to see... Actually, I think it's pretty obvious we're going to see pretty much a lot of the same cards and archetypes and engines at Worlds. I'm not too excited about that, but hey, I was going to say last year Worlds was good, but it wasn't. So there's that. Anyway, hopefully this year it's interesting, but the additional shared card I think kind of makes it bland, because it's like, oh yeah, now you're just throwing in Fallen and the Virtuous alongside whatever other previous cards you would have. So there you go. I'm going to call it quits there. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you guys did indeed enjoy it, and let me know down below what you would use as your 5 shared cards. And remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye.